Hey everyone, I'm Harish and I'm a distinguished engineer at Verizon. I'm based in New York City and excited to participate in this event here. Thank you for attending. And so, in the past, also, I've spoken at a few other events on a similar topic, but I wanted to focus on this presentation for specifically around automation and how user feedback can be taken into account and use that effectively to drive automation. So, considering that that's the theme, I thought this presentation was very relevant for that context. Before again I believe begin the presentation, just wanted to highlight that I'm currently working in technical product management at Verizon, and I manage a product called Verizon Cloud, which is one of the biggest products for Verizon outside of the telecom. So a lot of my work involves looking at this product, setting roadmap for in terms of new features or product improvements. And here I'll use a lot of data analytics to be able to actually provide value to the customer, understand more about the user, and how to use data insights, how to use our understanding of the customer to drive automation, to improve the user experience, to ultimately deliver value to the user. So that's part of my day-to-day job. Apart from that, I also focus on innovation, coming up with new product ideas, and constantly try to launch something in the market, take feedback, and improve on that. So with that, let me get started. So the topic, as I said, is how do you leverage user feedback to drive automation? So user feedback is something that I closely relate to and use it extensively as part of my work. And I always feel that it is severely underutilized at work. So a lot of times we try to look at various interactions with the user, try to see what touch points we have with the user, what are the users talking about the product, and ultimately make decisions. So how can you actually now not only use the data to make decisions, but also can you automate a lot of decision making or improvements based on user feedback? So let me first set the context by understanding what are the ways in terms of where you get like user feedback. So companies typically do a lot of qualitative analysis where they reach out to certain customers and learn from them about what they think about the product, what are the good things and what are the bad things. So apart from qualitative, there are also quantitative elements as well, where you can actually extract feedback. So commonly, if you're managing, let's say, an application, a mobile application, you have Apple Play Store or Apple or like Google Play Store. And typically, if before you download an application, or if you're really happy with an application or unhappy with an application, you can go to the Play Store or App Store to leave a rating or look at what others are talking about the application. So that's one of the ways we get a lot of feedback for a particular application from the user. So those are referred to as like app store ratings. Now, a lot of times, irrespective of if it's a mobile application or a web application or any other interaction, even at a store level, also you have something called in-app ratings that I define as, which is essentially it's not at a app store level where Apple or Google are managing those reviews and ratings, but you yourself through the interactions at different touch points are collecting this feedback. And you might have seen this sometimes when you're using a certain feature, or you've, let's say, finished a call, for example, and there is a prompt that comes to you asking you, hey, how was the experience? Like, do you want to give a thumbs up or a thumbs down, or a 5-star rating, and so on. So these are all like in-app ratings essentially, where you can collect like a lot of good inputs from the user apart from the Play Store and Apple Store. Now, there are certain limitations to looking at app stores, ratings, and reviews. So, one of the biggest challenges is if you go to any Apple Play Store or Google Play Store, you don't have any context on the user. What I mean by that is you can only see a rating or a review if a lot of times people don't even leave a proper review. A lot of times it's just venting out. So you don't have absolutely any context on the user, and this context is very important to drive any kind of automation, right? Irrespective of user feedback or not, like anytime when you're thinking about automation, uh, the context is very important, because without the context, without understanding the history of the user or who the user is and what their needs are, it's very difficult to automate anything. And even if you were to automate without having that context, you often actually don't cater to the needs of the user. Just for a second, like, think about going to a store, and imagine the store is all automated, and imagine yourself in this store. You are looking for certain things, but let's say because there's no context on who the user is or who you are, let's say they promote certain products to you, which are not relevant for you at all, and so that experience is a terrible experience. Imagine you're watching YouTube, for example, and your recommended videos that absolutely, in fact, you hate or you're not interested in those. So, any kind of like automation, for it to happen, it's really important to understand the context and the preferences, and based on that, make some recommendations or automate certain processes. So, first thing is, as I said, the problem with the app store ratings is there's no context on what is their age, what geography are they from, what kind of plan they are using, are they using, let's say, a premium version or a free version. So without that context, someone leaves a review, you can't really, one, use that for any kind of automation, and second, you don't know what to do with that data also, because how do you analyze this to make improvements? The second problem is adverse selection, which essentially means people who are unhappy or very happy will go on to the app store and leave a rating, right? And most likely, a lot of times we've seen people who are really unhappy are more likely to go and leave a rating than people who are happy, because it takes some amount of effort. People want to go and vent out. So that's why there is an adverse selection problem, and hence it's not a true representation of the sentiment in the entire user base. So a lot of times it's more skewed towards like unhappy users. And I think this adverse selection, not only in the context of user feedback, it's also important for you to think about like any kind of automation as well. And this adverse selection could be applicable in different ways. So for example, let's say even in insurance, right? People who are more likely to, let's say, fall sick and who need hospitalization or who needs a lot of healthcare services, they are the ones who will aggressively participate in getting insurance, right? Or people who are sort of like spending a lot on credit card and who are out of control with expenses, they are the ones who are actively always looking for more credit cards, versus people who are like spending more in a rational fashion. So a lot of times companies have to deal with this adverse selection problem. So if you're trying to automate any process, always think about how the users are trying to skew you in terms of thinking that, okay, this is the larger population. So some users who are more loud, vocal, or who are doing certain things, they might create this perception that or create a bias in the data that this is the true representation, but oftentimes that's not always the case. So there'll always be extremes, both positive and negative, but you have to in some way sort of like smoothen that a little bit, or understand who the customer is before you automate anything. So I think this adverse selection is really important in that case. The last thing in terms of app store rating is like constantly changing ratings, where sometimes there are a lot of bots who are spamming certain app stores. Sometimes people are leaving irrelevant Apple app store ratings or reviews. Sometimes they want to rate a different application and they end up rating like sort of like completely different application. So these are some of the things that happen as well. And again, this is again in larger context of automation also. There is always this challenge where you have to remove the noise. There'll always be irrelevant data that is being generated. And so how do you remove that before you automate anything? Because otherwise your automation is not going to be perfect. So these are sort of the key things that you need to take care of. And this is what I do at my work, but think of it as any kind of automation. These are the three things. Just to quickly summarize for your benefit: one, always try to focus on getting as much context and the user as possible, which means collecting more and more data about the user. The better you will understand the user and help in sort of automation. The second is adverse selection. Think about various ways your users are skewing the data either towards positive or very negative or extremes, and how do you sort of smoothen that out so that you represent the data represents the entire spectrum of the users and not selectively certain users. And the third, look at like irrelevant data or noise in the data that you can remove to actually get like good quality data to you to be able to automate. If without good quality data, if your data is not really important in terms of actually good qualitative information, you're actually going to go far away from what the user needs are. And oftentimes most of the data scientists spend a lot of time, 95% I believe, whenever I speak with people, 95% of data science or automation is mostly cleaning the data, getting good quality data. The 5% is actually creating a process, creating workflows and so on. And with lot of tools available these days, I think that process has become very easy. So you should focus more on collecting the data, qualitative data, cleaning the data, and 95% of it goes in that. 5% only goes in actually creating that automation processes and refining it. So, one of the things that I was able to do with in-app ratings. So now we are switching gears to in-app ratings, where anytime in a store or in an app or any kind of user interaction on a website, you can collect these ratings from the user, and these are not something the user has to go and give. You're automatically collecting them at different touch points. And here in this kind of like data, you can actually see what is the trend in terms of what is the sentiment, etc. But there's a lot more useful insights that you can draw as well. For example, you can create like multiple triggers using the data. What I mean by that is, at different touch points, it's very important when you think about automation, especially from a customer point of view. What are the touch points that you want to automate? What are the important touch points you want to collect user feedback? For example, one of the things that we do in an application is, as soon as they initially sign up or log in, you can collect that data, which is typically on day one. We call it day one of someone signing up on the app or logging in into the app, the very first time they come in. Next, you can also collect it on, like, let's say something like a day 7. You can also do it at day 30, day 60, and so on. So it varies from app to app depending on what is the functionality of the app. But the good thing about these kind of triggers to collect data is you can actually decide when these intervals should be, when you're collecting this important piece of information. So typically one of the things that we do is, day 1, day 7, day 30, and so on, but also give a manual option for the users to go on the app and give a rating or a review. And good thing is you can design these triggers. So for example, you can actually design it based on a geography, you can design it based on age, or you can design it based on plan type. So there are so many ways that you can actually create flows or algorithms or rules where you can collect the data based on different touch points of the user. So this is just one example where we've sort of like seen sentiment analysis on different days where we've had interactions with the customer, and this can be very powerful. For example, let's say day 7, a lot of people tend to leave. I'm just giving an example here. A lot of times people tend to leave the application or cancel a particular plan, or leave a certain service in the first few days, because that's the critical period where a lot of people are deciding, okay, should I continue or should I not? And especially in the world of subscription, that plays a huge role. So any kind of automation, you have to think about from a customer point of view, what are the critical periods where they're making certain decisions. And let's say in this case, we saw, for example, that day 7, a lot of people tend to leave the platform or cancel the subscription. So before they leave, actually, what we can do is on day 6, for example, collect a lot of feedback as to are you happy with the application or not. And so people who give a negative rating, we know that okay, these people are going to leave the platform. We know beforehand, we are getting a leading indicator almost, who's actually going to leave your subscription, and that data can be very powerful to automate certain things, and I'll share more examples about that. But I think it's really critical to identify, when you automate as well, what are the factors that you want to use to automate as well. Some factors are not very useful, some factors are more like lagging indicators and they're not very helpful at all. But it's really important to understand what are the factors that can actually help you predict, even before the customer tells you that they want to leave your subscription. You might want to predict that someone is going to leave the subscription, and it can be not just subscription, it can be any kind of task as well. You always want to predict what the user is going to do, and based on that prediction you want to maybe automate certain things. So think about, like in your case, when you're automating, what are the factors that are important, and second, what are the events that you want to sort of almost predict from a user point of view, so that even before they take action you can actually help them out in certain ways. uh, so this is just an example of, what could be a different type of segmentation of a user. So when you think about automation, right, if you try to automate everything for all users, like, without really understanding the needs of the user, you might actually again not give them what they want. So any kind of automation, it's really important to understand what are the variations, how are, let's say, satisfaction levels or performance of an automation based on different factors. So in our case, one thing I was able to do was really identify the customer segments based on their satisfaction scores. So one of the things that we were able to do, for example, here is one versus plan 2. We were able to see which plan people are more happier, which plan users are more happy and tend to stay longer on the product. And and this is not just at a plan level. You can use different other types of filters as well. For example, you can think of like geography, age, or other kind of demographics. You can think about like plan type, when did they actually activate, or how much time they've spent on your product, what are the channels that they're coming through. And this is very important always, the channel. Sometimes, let's say, someone who's coming from a website versus someone who's coming from a store level, their perception of the product might be different, the marketing might be different, and so how they think about the product is completely different, and that will affect their satisfaction score as well. Or other factors could be, what features are they using and what version of the app they are. Sometimes, there are multiple releases of the same app, so what kind of version are they using, are they updating constantly. And lastly, engagement. How engaged are they with the product? Are they using your product, let's say, only 10 times in a year, or is it 10 times in a month? So based on the level of engagement also, you can actually kind of understand who the user segment is. So the bottom line or the summary from this slide is, when you think about automation, you have to not think of all users or all kind of like automation processes in a very uniform static way, because everything is different for based on the context, based on the user. So what you have to do is, if you're thinking from a user perspective, always think about which are the segments, how do you segment this entire customer base into smaller buckets, and based on those you actually create processes for each of those individual segments, because each user segment will be different. So for example, people in North America or America, the needs will be very different from like someone in like India or Africa, right? So it's really context dependent. It's really important to understand the user. So one of the things that we were also able to do is not only ratings, you can get a lot of information from reviews as well. So we were able to automate like collection of these reviews, put it into like a word cloud, or automatically segment it into different sort of like problem statements as well, or categories of issues. So based on any review, let's say a user leaves a review today, we immediately automate it to put it into a certain bucket. It could be, let's say, a bug fix, or it could be slow performance, or it could be some kind of usability. Whatever it is, we are able to automate this entire process to create any kind of review or feedback. We immediately are able to put it into different categories, and based on that we are able to review, okay, which category most people are complaining about, what are they mostly complaining about, is it performance, is it pricing, is it about the product or usability, and so on. So I think once we have that information, we are able to then put more resources into that kind of like a problem area or that category, and then sort of like work on it or improve the ratings. So these are some of the ways where you can also think about automation, where you're collecting user feedback and really understanding what the problems are in the product, and how do you then take automatic decisions to allocate resources as well. Let's say tomorrow you see there are two stores, for example. One store you see more complaints. How can you actually automatically divert more resources instead of manually doing it? You can automate those processes, divert more resources into store one versus store two, where you don't have problem. Or within a store also, let's say you have three different types of products or three different sections. Based on the kind of complaints, you can allocate more people into one category versus other. So these are some of the ways where customer feedback or reviews can be very powerful to automatically do resource allocation as well. Another important thing is to really think about like churn, right? Like a lot of times we focus on acquisition, but automation can be not only for acquisition but also avoiding churn or reducing churn. Or churn is essentially deactivation, right? Like anyone who is leaving the platform, we refer to it as churn. So it's really important to see why are people unhappy with a particular product. So getting to the root cause of it, that is one. Second is predicting that as well is important. I think we saw in one of the other slides as well, that ability to predict that okay, someone is going to deactivate or churn can be very powerful, because they're literally telling you, the users are telling you that hey, I'm unhappy with your product, I'm going to leave the product. And if they're going to give this indication beforehand, if you're able to predict, then you can do a lot of things. For example, you can automate the entire process by offering discounts. For example, you can use the data to, let's say, maybe provide them certain offers that will keep them happier and longer in the platform. So overall, like a lot of user ratings feedback can be used for automation to predict churn, and also not just predict, but if you take it next step in terms of automation, you can also avoid churn by offering discounts, by offering any kind of promotions to keep them longer. One of the things that are commonly done is, a lot of times people offer them extra trial period. Instead of 1 month trial period, you can also offer like 2 month trial period if you know someone might be actually going to leave the platform. Once they have made the decision to leave, Then if you try to keep them back, it's really hard. It can be very difficult when to change someone's mind once they've already made a decision. So I think that predictability is very key and critical for automation, because you're not changing the decisions, or trying to change the decision of the user there. You're preemptively anticipating that and taking corrective measures. So here in this slide, there's a lot of data I see. I mean, I don't want to go into too much detail, but like the key bottom line is, the first point, which is out of the users who deactivated, 71% gave a 1 star and 17% gave a 5 star. Now what does this tell you? Basically it tells you that people who are unhappy, who are going to deactivate, are actually going to leave a 1 star rating even before they leave. As I mentioned earlier, we collect this information on day 6, before they leave the platform on day 7. So we can get a leading indicator that, okay, these are the users who gave a 1 star rating and they are the ones who are going to leave. And then you can, as I said, promote like, a lot of offers to keep them happy. But this is the crux of the data. The predictability from churn based on the app store rating or in-app rating is very critical. So let's talk about like another use case where automation can be used effectively. So you see this graph here. This is essentially, each point represents a different screen within the mobile application. So what I'm able to do here is I'm able to visualize how are people using my application. So this is a point of entry for the user. Let's say call it the home screen, and from here, where are users going to in the website or in the application? And the thicker lines indicate that these are the most commonly used sort of screens in some way, or these are the most commonly taken paths. So I was able to actually use this data to really understand how the users are navigating within the application. And a lot of times you'll be surprised, like for example, you will see certain dead ends where, the certain nodes like here, they're not connected to other nodes. That means the screen has sort of like a dead end, which is a bad experience. You want to be able to easily help users discover certain features. So the important takeaway from this is, you can use a lot of this data to visualize, but more importantly, once you know certain features are hard to navigate to, there's certain element of difficulty in navigation. A lot of times, certain good features are hidden. A lot of times, companies keep building more and more and more features, and then the problem is that the users don't know how to find the features on the website or on the application. So I think this kind of like analysis of data can really help you understand how are users navigating within the app, and can you automate it as well. When I say automate, let's say a particular user cares about certain features versus another user cares about some completely different features. How can you use this now effectively to change your home screen? You can show features that I care about. You can show videos. If it's a YouTube, you can show videos that I care about versus random videos. So I think this is like important, and this is all data driven, where you're understanding the past navigation patterns, the difficulty in uncovering certain features, and use that information to bring them all on the home screen. One of the things that one can do is not only collect ratings at a feature level, at an app level, but also at a feature level as well. Let's say there are 10 features, and you collect rating from the user on which of those features are important to them or they like. Let's say all the 5 stars out of 10 they gave, 5 of those like 5 star ratings, and a rest 5 they gave a low rating. Now what you could do is take the ones that they are happy about those features and put it on the home screen. So you can automate these kind of things to actually improve the overall experience on the application. One of the other things on the right side, if you see 1 star versus 5 star and engagement, so oftentimes we assume that users who are engaged are happy users. I think that's not always the case, and this assumption needs to be verified. So what I mean by that is, let's say a user is using your application 10 times in a month. Another user is only using your application 5 times in a month. A lot of times, tech companies and generally companies want to force the user to use the product as many times as possible, assuming that it will increase the stickiness, assuming that it will stay them make them stay longer and not deactivate. But I think that's not often always the case. Someone who is using your application 5 times a month might be more happy compared to someone who's using your application 10 times a month. So I think engagement is very critical, because it tells you that how your user is using your application. And if you connect it to the sentiment or the app store rating, I think that combination can give you more insight about your customers, and so you don't meaninglessly spend a lot of time on driving user engagement. I think one of the ways we were able to use this information to drive engagement is, or and also like automate certain things, is a certain feature where we think it's very valuable, and this helps the user to have higher satisfaction score. They're tending to stay longer on the platform. We use that particular feature, bring it on the home screen, we automate that process, and so that the user actually uses that particular feature more, versus it's not very difficult to identify that feature or discover that feature. So important takeaways: identify in your automation process what are the key features that the users care about, and how can you make them sort of more discoverable, and so the user will tend to use those more frequently and also be happy with your application. And uh, ultimately, from all of these important data points, automation, I think what we were able to do is, through automation, really personalize the experience. I think ultimately this is what matters, right? Like personalizing, because automation can have very negative consequences if you're not really personalizing it for the user. If you think of each user as an individual entity with their own unique needs, with their own unique contexts, eccentricities, quirks, whatever it is, I think that is very important to automation. If you think of your entire user segment as one sort of homogeneous group, and you create certain rules, then those rules will fail. So that's why a lot of times machine learning, deep learning, all of these like AI related algorithms, or processes and models are coming into play, because people have realized that you can't set rules for each and every user. And even if it is user segment, right? If you say, let's say, you have 10 user segments and you create rules for each of them, and within that user segment also, you might realize that there's actually a lot of diversity. If you think about, let's say, a geography, right? You can't think of like, you can segment the entire world's population into different countries, but even in that country you have so many varying needs of people based on income, based on age, based on gender, and so on. So you can't really think of everyone as a homogeneous group. So I think personalization is the key. If you're trying to automate personalization, you can start with a simple rule based approach. I think that's the quickest and the easiest to implement, and then tweak those rules going forward. But I think ultimate automation, a lot of it is driven by machine learning, AI models, where they're thinking of, or they're collecting data from every user, thinking of each user as a different entity almost, and then driving content, driving features, driving home screen personalization for entirely that particular user. So if two users open a application, they'll see a completely different home screen. So I think this is what is already happening, and we've used that in our product, and a lot of other companies are using it. But ultimate personalization automation, is a lot of it is driven by AI and machine learning. So just to give you an example, what we've been doing here on the home screen is, one, we are identifying who are the happy users, and once through the in-app ratings, and based on that you can actually ask them to upgrade to higher tier plan. You can overall take certain events, automate those events so that ultimately they purchase more or they take a higher tier plan, whatever it is, so you can drive ultimately average revenue per user. The second one is the feature rating or content, right? Like in the case of YouTube, it will be content, but in our case, it's like specific features or content as well. How do you, based on what the users care about, how do you change the order or sequencing on the home screen? I think that's something that we were able to do through automation. And lastly, for the unhappy users, let's say certain users are unhappy and they might leave the platform. They've given you a 1 star or a 2 star rating, that they're going to leave. How can you drive engagement by specific features that lead to either greater satisfaction, or by driving additional discounts and promotions to keep them longer so that they end up being your long term customer? I think these are some of the ways that we were able to do through simple models of automating the home screen or personalizing the home screen to machine learning models or simple rule based approaches as well. So with that, I'll conclude the presentation and just quickly summarize some of the key takeaways. So one, think about who are you automating for, how can you break these individual end users of this automation into different segments, I think. And how do you think about these users in a very unique way, because everyone has their own needs? Second, how do you collect as much context as possible on the user? And for this you need a lot of data. Collect as much data as possible. Third is quality data. Clean the data, remove the noise, filter the noise, remove any kind of biases, smoothen the edges so that you get like really good data. And lastly, collect data in terms of reviews, ratings, and so on, so that you can actually understand who the happy user is, who is the unhappy user. And based on this kind of data, you can drive a lot of automation and personalize the experience ultimately. So automation is not just creating processes to reduce the effort, but also how do you personalize it that it solves problems for all your end users. So with that, let me conclude and say thank you for giving me this opportunity. And if you guys have any questions, I'm happy to take them now.
Thank you so much, Harish. Well, first of all, let me say that I thought this was a very, very excellent presentation. You know that I'm a technology guy myself, so I actually really like how you kind of dived a little bit deeper into some of the underlying concepts of how that's happening. I saw a couple of questions coming in from the participants. For those of you who are listening live, if you still have questions for Harish, you can now still put them into the Q&A feature. Let me start with two questions which I think are very interesting, and I'm gonna project them on the screen real quick.
Yep.
The first question is from Marco. I found the triggers very interesting. Is there an optimal number of days after which to send a trigger? Should we set it to 1 day, 3 days, 7 days? Any advice? I think that's actually quite an interesting one.
Yeah, first of all, I think the concept of triggers itself is important, because you have to think about what are the touch points for the user, and it varies, right? Like depending on the user and depending on your application itself. Let's take an example, right? Like if it's a social media platform, some of the social media platforms almost want daily active users who want to come regularly on the application and do something, and engage on the platform, right? So in those cases, like a lot of times early on, almost like you can send like daily triggers without like bombarding and spamming them, but really collecting inputs on a more frequent basis in terms of day 1, day 3, day 7, and so on. But certain applications where that people don't use them very often, let's say it's it could be like your courses. You want to take an online course, maybe that course is scheduled in a way that every week you have to take certain assignments, or every month you have to take certain assignments. So in those cases, your triggers will be completely different, where your touch points will be not on a daily basis but on a weekly or a monthly basis. So you have to change your triggers accordingly. So I think if you take an example of habit formation, right, almost you want the user to come on the app on a daily basis to be able to change your habit. So a lot depends on what is the kind of application you're running. And I think it closely ties into what is your metric, right? Is it daily active users, is it weekly active users, or monthly active users that you're tracking? And based on that, you can automatically sort of set the triggers as well, so they go in hand. But again, there is no specific like science to this. In some way it's also experimentation, where you kind of collect the feedback and you try out like a few times maybe variations and see if there's any change in behavior, and based on that you actually improve, I would say. So a lot of it is experimentation, hypothesis building as well.
Yeah, a bit of trial and error, if I can summarize that. Okay, that's good. Then I see another question that has come in. Let me project that as well. That question is, I think, a little bit more on the soft skills.
Yeah.
What did you experience as the biggest challenge with automation?
Yeah, so I think this is a really good question again. So I think the biggest challenge with automation is first really defining what are your metrics, for automation. What is it that you're trying to do? A lot of times people want to automate things. You end up automating, you spend so much time on it, and you realize that it's not really moving the needle on the important metrics that you're actually trying to do. So I think I've done some automation which turned out to be like completely not fruitful, I would say. And there are sometimes automation where you don't anticipate such positive results, and then it actually pleasantly surprise you. So I think the first thing is, okay, what are your KPIs or OKRs, whatever it is, that you set upfront before automation. So I think that's the biggest challenge. What are those KPIs? How do you track them? And I think those things are important in terms of success, I would say. The second thing is, I think I alluded in the whole presentation. Automation is, it's not just taking a process and just improving efficiencies. I think it's improving efficiencies that it actually helps in the uh, end use case, right? Like it can be in my case personalization. If you automate a lot of features, content, but without any kind of personalization to the user, and you think of all everything as homogeneous bucket, I think you're going off what your end goal is. So I think that's another big challenge is, who are you optimizing for or automating it for, and what do they care about, and is this automation actually going to benefit them in any way or not? Otherwise it's going to reduce your effort for sure, which is great, but ultimately your user is not happy and they'll just leave the product. So what is the use of all this automation?
Good. I think I agree with you. And what I like that you said is that you've built automations which are fruitful or not so fruitful, that you thought were going to be very useful, and others that kind of were a nice surprise and that you didn't spend a whole lot of effort on, but they had a much larger part. I kind of recognize that as well, is that sometimes it's very difficult to plan in advance which kind of automations are going to be very successful or not.
Yeah, and sometimes it's good to keep manual, like it, everything in the world need not be automated, and I think we always strive for that, which is good. But I have seen that you spend so much energy and resources that you realize that, okay, a person could have actually done a job more efficiently, and oftentimes the automation might not lead to the best results. I think one good example that comes to my mind is, I think Tesla, in one of their manufacturing places, they try to automate a lot of things. They try to remove the humans, and they realize that they actually underestimated how good humans are in terms of putting a car together. And so they actually had to bring humans into the picture to improve the ultimately the product, which is the car in this case. So automation, although was helpful to a certain extent, they had to again come back and say, okay, let's get humans again. So I think it's really important to keep that in mind, which cases you want to keep manual human intervention, which cases you should automate.
Absolutely. I think that's very, very good advice. One last question that I would like to ask, as I mentioned before, I'm always a little bit of a technology geek. So I saw that you had that very cool graph which showed
Mhm.
in 3D how
Yeah.
people are using or how people are going through an app. Could you explain very briefly how you created that? And last but not least, are you willing to teach me how to do that?
Yeah, yeah, for sure. So I think so. I use this open source tool called Gephi,
Okay.
and it's available online for anyone. And it's very cool because you are able to take different data sets, and if you tweak it in terms of nodes and edges, you can actually see this visualization automatically generated. Actually, before even using it at a app level, where I'm able to see how people are going from the home screen to different screens, right, or even a website. I did this analysis for basketball teams. So what I was able to do was I was able to get basketball players. You can do it for soccer, whatever it is. How are users passing? How these players are passing ball between among themselves? So I created a sort of like a visual of, okay, who are the people who are getting most passes? Who are the people who are getting most successful passes? Who are the players who are passing more effectively? Who is the person who's scoring more effectively based on the passes? So I was able to create visualization for basketball teams as well, and I was able to draw a lot of insights as to which are the key players. So I think this kind of visualization, you can use it at a lot of different places. It can be for traffic, it can be for sports, it can be for technology app level, and there can be so many other use cases. So I think network analysis is what it's referred to. There's an entire science behind it. You can even do it for social media. For example, Twitter versus Facebook, the networks are very different. Like Twitter is defined for news spreading the fastest, right? How do you get from one node to the other in the fastest possible time? Versus social media like Facebook is, how is your network strongly correlated where one person is connected to many close friends? So it's a more tighter network, but it doesn't spread too fast. A news versus Twitter, it spreads too fast. So these kind of analysis can also be done through network analysis, I would say.
Very, very cool. Well, I think with that, we kind of found our topic for a next upcoming session. I would be very, very keen to invite you to kind of give a demonstration on how that could be done.
Yeah,
I
for
think that
sure.
would be absolutely fantastic. Harish, I want to thank you for your great contribution. This was a very, very insightful presentation, which really went into depth, which is always something that I'm really, really appreciating. It's a very cool topic, and then I think that is also very, very relevant for today. For those of you who don't know, I didn't mention it at the start, but Harish is actually presenting from the USA today, so it's quite late for him. So I would like to ask everyone to give him a big round of applause for, or virtual applause for being with us here today. It's super appreciated that you have taken the time, and it's really always a pleasure to pick your brain. You have some very, very excellent insights that always make it a real pleasure to listen to you explain. Thanks so much, Harish.
Thank you
Um,
so much for the opportunity, and you guys can reach out to me on LinkedIn if you have any follow-up questions. And thank you for this opportunity, and looking forward to the rest of the event as well. So excited to hear what the other speakers have to say. So I'll stay tuned in. Thank you so much
thanks,
again.
thanks so much, Harish. Good. And speaking about next and upcoming sessions, as you can see on the slide, I've already projected what are going to be our next key speakers for the next track. And we have some really, really great speakers coming up. I've had the pleasure to listen to both of them already earlier. So these are promising to be two very, very good sessions, and it's going to be very difficult to make a choice. The first next upcoming speaker is Kurt Bergmans, who is head of service management at the Adecco Group. And he is going to be talking about how do you use automation in a global IT service management environment. And he's going to share some of his lessons learned. The second main speaker for today is Eric Nguyen, who is at Synergy Group Australia. and he is going to be talking how to achieve business operational efficiencies through intelligent automation. I can promise you that whatever session you're choosing from, you won't be disappointed, because both of them are excellent speakers as well. Unfortunately, the session in track 2 is, due to unforeseen circumstances, unfortunately cancelled. So you would need to make a choice between either track 1 or track 3. We're going to close this session for now, and I'd love to see all of you back in 10 minutes when we're going to get started with the new upcoming sessions. Thanks everyone for your participation.